everybody, and thank you for joining me today. As you can see, I'm not in my usual location in my home in South Australia. I'm actually in Geneva on the other side of the world attending meetings for the ILO, but I've had a lot of requests for this video, so I thought that despite the jet lag, I would give it a go. So bear with me because I haven't had much sleep. A lot of people are asking me, how could the West Australian Parliament have voted against birth equality in such overwhelming numbers this week? And so I thought it was important to address how this happened. This sort of really kicked off a couple of weeks ago when this bill was introduced into the lower house, and Amber Jade Sanderson, who's the health minister in WA, so she's the one behind this law. She's from the left faction of the Labor Party, very radically pro-abortion in her ideology. And so she told the West Australian, she said there's a scare campaign being run by Christians and that there's misinformation out there. She said there's no such thing as a baby born alive after an abortion. That was clearly untrue. Through questions asked on notice in the Parliament, starting with Ed Derrimer in 2011 and continuing later with other politicians asking those questions, we actually know that there are 28 children who've been born alive and left to die without a legal right to care under WA law since 1998. Now, she said explicitly there is no such thing as a child born alive after an abortion, and it was just not true. And yet she was saying that the other side was perpetuating misinformation. Now, this was obviously called out by myself and by others, and in the Parliament she then said there is such a thing as an abortion where a child is born alive, but they're all intended live births, and all of those 28 children have been held until their final moments. Now, she didn't provide any evidence for that claim, and no one even asked her to provide the evidence, which shows you just how weak the lower house in WA is and how they did not scrutinise anything that she said. She just got away with any sort of claim that she wanted to make. So, you know, she started off by saying there's no such thing as a child born alive after an abortion. She then had to correct that because it was really clear through questions asked on notice that that was not true. It wasn't the West Australian newspaper or the media that held her to account. It was people like me on social media that really called her out. And so she did have to acknowledge the truth. But then she, excused it away by saying that these children were all intended to be born alive and they were held by their parents. And in fact, she said it's for religious and cultural reasons that labour is induced and the child is born alive and feticide isn't given. So that's what she said. No evidence provided that these were intended live births. No evidence provided to justify her claim that all of these children were held until their final moments. That's where the debate got left in the lower house. But then Labor MP Kate Doust, who's a very brave and courageous woman, because she is really standing up against Amber Jade Sanderson on this issue. And so she introduced an amendment based on a principle of birth equality. It's based on Section 7 of the South Australian Termination of Pregnancy Act, which says that if a child is born alive after an abortion, they should be treated no differently to any other child. So it's a simple equal treatment provision. It just means that a clinical assessment occurs at birth, and an assessment is made as to whether that child should have palliative care because they are going to die, or whether there is a case for life-saving treatment because they could live. Now, that's the kind of assessment that's made when any child is born in a wanted pregnancy. But at the moment in WA, and also in states like Victoria and Queensland, there's no provision making the clinicians do this. These children fall through the cracks and they don't get that protection, that equal treatment. So it's a really simple provision. And I guess I was pretty naive in thinking that there would be broad support for that in the WA Parliament. I guess I hadn't realised how much of a stranglehold Amber Jade Sanderson has over her party, and how these MPs, particularly in Labor, but also the Greens MP, they just didn't even care about the facts or the data or the stories that we know of. But they just towed the party line, the Amber Jade Sanderson line, and voted for, which allows abortion right up until birth. It allows children to be born alive and left to die without a legal right to care. And it even provides to hide the data on the issue so that there's no mandatory reporting to the coroner. So we don't even collect information now as a result of this new law. So the situation is 100 times worse than it was, because it also increases the likelihood of a late-term abortion because the process has been made so much easier to access. So let's look at the Upper House debate then. Kate Doust introduces her amendment. Sue Ellery is the woman in the Upper House who has the job of arguing against giving babies a legal right to care. So she's, essentially Amber Jade Sanderson's lackey in the Upper House, the person leading the debate for the government. And remember, Kate's in her own party, so they're both from the same party. And so it's really courageous of Kate, I think, to be calling Sue out on this. And Kate starts by introducing the amendment and asking Sue Ellery, well, what sort of care is given to children in this situation who are born alive? And Sue Ellery says, look, I think they are intended live births. They're held by their parents for the minutes and up to an hour that they live for. She said, if you want to know clinically what's done, I'm going to have to take that on notice. I don't have the answer. So right away, I think that's a really shocking response from Sue Ellery. I mean, this is a bill that will not give a legal right to care to children born alive, and she can't even say what the clinical principles and practices are when a clinician is faced with a live birth after an abortion. She says, I think all of these children are held, they live for a matter of minutes and up to an hour. Now that's not correct either. There was a study in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 2018, a highly reputable study, and it showed that out of 241 late-term abortions where feticide hadn't been given, half the children had been born alive, and actually the average survival time was 32 minutes, and one child in that study even survived for over 4 hours. So this idea that a child will only survive at most up to an hour is just incorrect. And the other thing is, Sue Ellery doesn't even give any substantive information on what is the clinical response when a child is born alive. Because if you have a situation where a child is born alive and the parents don't want to hold that child, which is conceivable given that they've gone in for this abortion, which is a procedure intended to end the life of that child, and for whatever reason that child's been born alive, and maybe sometimes it has been intended, but if the parents don't want to hold the child, or the child is living for too long, then who holds the child then? And how are the emotional and physical needs of that child met? Sue Ellery had no answer for that and gave no specificity around it. And we know from the case of Kaya Blue Watson in the UK, he was a 18-week-old child, born at 18 weeks, and his parents did not expect a live birth. He actually lived for 10 hours at 18 weeks gestation. His mother said it was like torture. She said she would never have gone in for the abortion if she'd known that he could live for that long. He was apparently diagnosed with Edwards syndrome in utero, but when he came out, she honestly doubted whether he even had that syndrome because he was such a fighter and he clung to life for so long. I sort of think, well, Sue Ellery, what's your response to that? So if a child is born alive in WA and lives for hours, which you have discounted as saying can't happen, what's the obligation on clinicians now that Kate Doust's amendment has not passed? And this is a real concern that these children could for hours be left there. I mean, we also have the case of the unnamed baby at Westmead Hospital. We know from that situation, her parents went in for the abortion because she had a congenital abnormality, a heart defect, and she was born alive. She was held for about an hour by her parents, but then there's actually a complete abrogation of responsibility on behalf of any of the adults in that child's life. Then the child ends up in a medical waste bin while still breathing and alive. So you might have a situation where parents will hold that child initially after birth, but then the child lives for too long, is given to the doctors, and then there's a question of who takes care of the physical and emotional needs of that child. I mean, this is completely barbaric that we don't have a legal obligation to care for these children. So that was the first thing that happened in the debate. The next thing that happened in the debate is Nick Goran got up. Now, he's a West Australian Liberal MP who, again, like Kate, has been extremely courageous on this issue. He has been asking questions on notice year after year after year to get the data out about children born alive after an abortion. And so Nick confronted Sue Ellery with something she had said last week.
The question was also asked by the honourable member about feticide, when it was introduced and why is 22 weeks deemed appropriate. So I'm advised the following. Feticide is usually performed for gestations greater than 22 weeks. It is not deemed clinically necessary prior to 22 weeks as the fetus is fragile and will not survive the labour process.
The feticide is an injection into the baby's heart. It's either potassium chloride or digoxin, and the child then dies in utero and then they're born dead. So they're a stillborn baby. Now, Sue Ellery had said in the Parliament, we give feticide after 22 weeks. We don't need to do it before that because it's impossible for a child to be born alive. They're too fragile and they won't survive the birth canal. So Nick Garan gets up and he asks a series of questions pointing Sue Ellery to the data, because through questions asked on notice, we can see there's at least 3, but possibly 6 children who before 20 weeks gestation have been born alive in WA since 1998. So there's really clear data on this. Sue Ellery is either lying or just plain ignorant, because she gets up 3 times and says, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to play you the exchange now so that you can see it.
Minister, we were told last week that feticide has been introduced from 22 weeks gestation and later because it is not possible, we were told, for a child to survive the birth canal prior to 22 weeks. So how then is it possible that there are 3 cases in Western Australia, at least 3 cases, of babies who showed signs of life after an abortion procedure when they were less than 20 weeks gestation?
I don't know where you get the view that they must be pre-20 weeks abortions. I understand the point you're making and that you want clarification, you're entitled to it. I don't have any further information here. I mean, I can take on board what you're asking and ask the Minister to provide you with that information, but I don't have any other information that I can see.
The House was informed last week that the reason that feticide has been introduced at 22 weeks gestation and it is because it is not necessary before 22 weeks. We were told it's not necessary for there to be feticide prior to 22 weeks because it is not possible for the child to survive the birth canal. Is it possible for the child to survive the birth canal prior to 20 weeks?
I can't say to you, your assumption that we must be talking about pre-20 weeks is correct. I don't know if it is or not. I have no other information available to me. I don't think there's someone sitting there with this information at their fingertips. I don't have any other information available to me now. I can give you an undertaking to provide that, but I don't know when I might get the answer to that.
Her response is just not good enough. She's leading the debate in the House against an amendment that would give an equal right to care for these children. And she doesn't even know the data from her home state, which shows that at least 3, but possibly 6 children have been born before 20 weeks gestation alive after an abortion. She also doesn't know that a child can survive before 22 weeks and be born alive. Now, they're probably not viable, but they are alive. They're breathing and, like the child in the UK that lived for 10 hours at 18 weeks gestation, they can live for a very long time. And so this is really concerning that she just can't give him a straight answer and she just doesn't seem to even know the facts. We know from the UK there was another child actually born at 16 weeks gestation, and the nurse in that case just dumped the child in an incontinence pad and the child lay there until she passed, and the nurse was struck off the register for that because she was totally negligent and just it was disgusting what she did. But yet under Sue Ellery's worldview, the child couldn't possibly be born alive at 16 weeks gestation because she says it's impossible before 22 weeks. Closer to home in Queensland in 2020, baby Xantha was born at 19 weeks gestation in a Queensland hospital, the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, and she lived for 7 minutes, dumped in an empty hospital room, no one to hold her or take care of her. Sue Ellery has no response to something like that. So that was the next thing that happened, and I commend Nick for being so tenacious. He got up 3 times to ask that question of Sue Ellery, and he just kept not answering it and sort of brushing it aside. And so then the very next thing that happens is Lorna Harper gets up, and this is what she says.
We are discussing about whether or not the women make decisions with their doctors as to what they are going to be doing. We're not here to listen to a sermon talking about live bus. We are here talking about the legislation. And to be sermonised about it again and again and again, I find highly offensive. This is hard enough as it is because we now know more about abortion than most people ever want to know. The details are discomforting for everybody, but to actually then try and highlight the most discomforting pieces for us to try and make us feel guilty, shame, 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 shame.
So this is really interesting, isn't it? Because you can see in Lorna Harper, she is really angry at Nick Guerin, and she's sort of talking about how people are sermonising, and she says abortion is really uncomfortable and we now know more about abortion than we ever wanted to know. Look, this is ridiculous. Like, she is rampantly pro-abortion, has voted for a bill that would allow abortion right up until birth for any reason and allow children to be born alive after an abortion without a legal right to care. And she's getting angry at people who are daring to critique that position. I mean, she should know more about abortion than the average person because she's a parliamentarian who's been charged with the job of making laws on this subject. So her response is just completely out of order in this regard. And she then says, you know, shame on you for bringing up live births. Well, this is a real issue. Like, we know that children are born alive after an abortion. That study I mentioned before showed that 1 in 2 children, when feticide isn't given, are born alive. And the fact that Lorna Harper is trying to like bully and intimidate, and she keeps shouting actually, like she sits down from this moment and then Nick Guerin gets up and she starts shouting at him, you know, and these outbursts are recorded in the Hansard. But it's just ridiculous, like the intimidation from people like her and Amber Jade Sanderson and Sue Ellery, who are trying to just intimidate anybody that asks a question or dares critique their position, which is such an extreme position and one that's out of step with the Australian people. I mean, she just doesn't want a debate on this issue. She doesn't want any spotlight shone on the issue of children born alive. And so, you know, I think Lorna Harper just really exposes herself in that moment as an incredibly weak politician, not fit to serve in the parliament. She shouldn't be there. If she doesn't have the stomach to grapple with really difficult ethical questions like live births after an abortion, she just shouldn't be there. You know, she's clearly guilty, I think. Like, I looked at that. What do you guys think? I looked at that and I thought her conscience is clearly like going off. Like, there's alarm bells in there, but she's just like fighting it at all costs. And instead she sort of says, shame on you for daring bring this up. But really, I think she's the one left exposed. And, you know, this test of time, like the historical lens that one day people will apply to this issue, they'll look back and they'll look at people like Lorna Harper, they'll look at people like Sue Ellery, they'll look at people like Ayor, who said, I want to be a voice for the voiceless, and then votes for children to be left to die without a legal right to care, you know, and they'll look back at those people and think, you really ran roughshod over the human rights of children. I mean, Lorna Harper says, I believe a woman should get to do whatever she wants with her body. It's her business. At the point of a live birth, it's clearly not her business. You have 2 Australians, you have 2 human beings who are breathing with human rights and are persons under the law. So her response is the woman's business is just completely and woefully inadequate. The next thing that happens is Kate Doust asks Sue Ellery, what are the clinical guidelines in WA if a live birth occurs? Now, remember earlier in this debate, Sue Ellery hasn't been able to answer this question. So Kate Doust reads out the clinical guidelines that exist in Queensland. She puts this to Sue Ellery and says, do we have any similar kind of written guideline in WA about what to do? Again, Sue Ellery, no idea, and says, no, as far as I know, we don't have any of those guidelines. Now, this is really interesting to me because just a couple of weeks ago, we had a Senate report handed down on this issue. And in that report, they said, we don't need a federal law protecting children born alive because we have guidelines in states and territories. That, you know, clearly we don't have one in WA based on what Sue Ellery said. And what it does mean is that if children are born alive, there is no guidance given to clinicians about what to do. And we saw in the case of Jessica Jane in the Northern Territory how the coroner, Greg Kavanagh, was scathing of a situation where just that happened. A child is born alive unexpectedly. Nurse Williams delivered that child. The child had good weight, good ABCAR scores, you know, was crying. She calls the doctor who ordered the abortion, and the doctor doesn't give her any direction about what to do. So the nurse wraps the child, puts the child in an empty room on a metal kidney dish, and Jessica lies there for 80 minutes until she passes. So none of her physical or emotional needs being met. Jessica was a completely healthy child, probably at around 22 to 23 weeks gestation. But Sue Ellery has no response for a situation like that. And the final thing that happens in this appalling debate is Brian Walker gets up. Now, he's from the Cannabis Party. He's a doctor, so, the impression I got watching him is that he thinks like I know a lot about this issue, and he sort of gets up, I think very sort of patronisingly, and says, look, this is a ridiculous amendment. These children are not going to survive. At 26 weeks, a child has no chance of survival. They are not viable.
At 26 weeks, that is simply not a viable pregnancy should everything be left as it is. The amount of effort that goes into maintaining this life at 26 weeks, was probably the earliest you could imagine, is enormous. Let us take us now down to 23 weeks. Take that one step further, to 23 weeks, which we're limiting just now. And you may well get a live birth, but not a viable birth. Absolutely not supporting the idea of giving all that intensive care to fruitlessly try and prolong a life which is destined to end shortly.
First of all, that's a misinterpretation of the provision. It's an equal treatment provision. It's not a mandating life-sustaining treatment provision. If a live birth occurs, you have to do a clinical assessment and work out what are the chances of survival for that child. And if they're not going to survive, then it's important to make them comfortable and to give them palliative care until they pass. So it's not what Dr. Brian Walker said, which is mandating life-sustaining treatment. It's not that. So he didn't understand the provision. But then the second point is he gets up and says, children aren't viable at 26 weeks. And he's completely wrong about that, actually.
I just want to draw to your attention some information from the Child and Adolescent Health Service of Western Australia. They say that the survival rate for babies who get admitted to the neonatal intensive care unit is approximately 60% at 23 weeks, and it rises to 80% at 24 to 25 weeks. So the reason that I want to put that on the record, Deputy Chair, is that there was a suggestion by the Honourable Member that I think it's difficult to survive at 23 weeks. I'm sure that is true, and I'm sure that it is probably impossible to survive without the assistance of the neonatal intensive care unit. But the point is this, Deputy Chair, is that we know that the survival rate is 60% at 23 weeks. And we know that this rises to 80% at 24 to 25 weeks.
The data shows that increasingly with medical interventions and active resuscitation, children are surviving earlier and earlier. All of this is just a complete and utter disappointment, because on the one hand, you've got people like Nick and Kate who are presenting data and facts and asking very good questions. And then the other hand, you have Sue Ellery who can't answer their questions. She does not know her brief. You've got Lorna Harper, who's trying to intimidate Kate and Nick into not talking anymore about this. You've got Brian Walker, who doesn't know the science on this, despite the fact that he's a doctor, and being very patronising on the issue. And then ultimately, a vote is called, and we see 23 MPs vote against the Doust Amendment to give birth equality to these children, and only 9 vote to give these children a right to care if born alive after an abortion. And so out of those 32 MPs, only 6 spoke in the Parliament. In a debate of this nature, of one that's so serious because it affects the human rights of the youngest, most vulnerable Western Australians, only 6 MPs spoke, and the rest just voted according to the dictates, I think, of the factional leaders in the Labor Party and in the Greens. I just think that's so appalling, and what it exposes to me is how we need to get rid of those 23 MPs from our Parliament. So we need to hold them to account, and I'm going to be providing resources to do that in the coming days and weeks. And certainly by the WA election, we're going to make sure that every West Australian knows about this issue. So please forward this video on, sign up to my mailing list, drjoannahowe.com/join, follow me on Instagram, Facebook, because that's how we build our community and we activate people on this issue.